So can you briefly, just for the sake of it, your book goes into depth, and I get it. Like we have to be brevities are what we have to run with here. God before the Bible is something you also deal with. And what I mean is the God that we see in the Bible wasn't originally in the Bible. This is something older. Can you briefly tell us about that and how that can maybe shape the picture of how we should view the God of the Bible?
Yeah. So, like, the short answer is that the texts that we have in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but particularly in the Hebrew Bible, so Old Testament, were written over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they've been reshaped and recrafted over time. But they're drawing on some of them are drawing on much older traditions and mythologies. And so the example that you gave, some Christians read into God saying, let us make man in our own image. They read into that the notion of the Trinity. The Trinity is not even really a proper notion in the New Testament, let alone, obviously, it's not in the Hebrew Bible at all. So, as I was saying, this God of Judaism and Christianity is a post-biblical creation. So the deity that we find reflected in these biblical texts is a deity who was very much part and parcel of a polytheistic system. He was not he wasn't this solitary deity. He was networked into a much broader household, if you like, of deities. We have one particular text in the book of Deuteronomy. It's a very old piece of almost like fossilized poetry that sort of speaks of a mythology whereby Yahweh, who becomes known as the God of Israel, the God of the Bible, was originally a son. He had a dad. His dad was El, the high god, who was, the high god in the Levantine part of the world. And originally, Yahweh was simply kind of one of that younger generation of deities, a son of a high god and high goddess, who gradually, in this particular part of the southern Levant that we now know as modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, that this particular deity sort of eventually sort of slowly starts to kind of take over a lot of the roles and functions of this high god. He basically, you could say, in theory, he kind of overthrows his own father, as is very typical in a lot of ancient mythology. But that's how it starts. So this was a god that originally had a dad, and he had a consort, a wife, the goddess Asherah. And he was, he was the head by the get to that time of the Iron Age, to say around about the 9th century BCE. He was pretty much the head of his own local pantheons. But there were other deities and divine beings worshipped alongside him in those pantheons. So a lot of the regulations that we read in the Bible, you shall not have any other gods, I'm a jealous God, these are all later reflections of a prioritization of this deity that have been retrojected back into the story of the religious past that the Bible presents. So yeah, it's a very different kind of divine world, if you like, than the one that we might imagine.
If I were to put a guess on this, because scholars don't like guessing, but for the sake of guessing, because you wouldn't put this in paper and say this is the truth. If you were to put a guess on when that happened, when it became this God, only this God, not even getting into when does he become kind of philosophized outside of space and time, which takes place eventually. When would you say what you're describing there takes place, this regulation to like cut off and become purely monotheistic, if you put a guess on it?
Okay, so with all the kind of scholarly footnoting and nuancing that I'm instinctively feel the need to give, I would say around about, say, 500 BCE. That's when you start to get this emphasis on worshipping Yahweh alone. But that's only among these particular kind of scribal communities that are quite elite, quite high status. So we know that not everybody in this part of the world that worshipped Yahweh was thinking the same. We know a similar kind of time. You've got a group of Yahweh worshippers on an island in the Nile called Elephantine, who have built a temple to Yahweh, and they're worshipping other deities alongside Yahweh there. So it's not that this was a kind of a blanket sort of shift in theology or ideology, but it's the one that became dominant because it's these particular scribal groups, it's their texts that became so authoritative within Jerusalem and in certain communities in Mesopotamia. And with that kind of authority came a gradual change, I guess, in the way in which this deity was understood.
Wow. Yeah, there's so many interesting things that come from this book. I like will always keep talking about this throughout the video. So I hope everyone sees like, okay, I got to get this. I'm not kidding. And if you can't read, get it on Audible. Listen to it on Audible. It's read by her. So it's
I apologize in advance for that as well.
no, it was really good actually. I enjoyed it.